Hey everybody, welcome back to our final lecture. It's hard to believe we're finally here and end of the course has finally arrived, and this is your final case study. So what we're going to be doing today is looking at an example of a case study where perhaps we can see some examples of how we can end terrorism. And to do that, we're going to use the FARC as our particular case study. And we've mentioned them a few times before throughout the class, but we're going to focus on them today to see how we can potentially end up in a situation where we can end terrorism, but also how trying to end terrorism can be a fairly fragile process. So to start out, give you a little background on the FARC. And the FARC is a militant group that formed in Colombia in 1964 as communist revolutionaries, but they also had anti-imperialist agenda, very focused on supporting the agrarian population of Colombia. And what's important to remember here is, again, this is a really good example to also think about various issues that we've focused on and talked about throughout the class, about how we define terrorism is a difficult subject and how there can be a lot of disagreements because there are a lot of scholars, politicians, even the FARC itself, they wouldn't label themselves as terrorists. They call themselves a guerrilla movement, or they call themselves an armed uprising, or they call themselves a legitimate military force. But for the purposes of this, they have been listed as a terrorist group by a number of countries. The Colombian government considers them a terrorist organization. And so just in this framing, we're thinking about them as a terrorist group. But it's important to remember that the context of what you think about it and how you define terrorist group and who does the defining makes a big difference. And the FARC was in a drawn-out struggle and conflict with the Colombian government for an extremely long period of time. As we'll talk about here, they finally signed a peace deal with the Colombian government in 2016, and the conflict started all the way back in 1964. So we have an extremely long, protracted conflict that saw up to about 220,000 people killed by the FARC and by government forces and government-related forces over this period of time, starting in 1964. So it had a pretty significant detrimental effect in terms of cost of human life in Colombia. It also had a significant negative impact on economic development in Colombia, as there was significant fighting. There was lack of control by the government in large swaths of territories. You can see here, these are different territories controlled. Gray controlled by the Colombian government, yellow by FARC. Red is the ELN, which is another group that's been considered a terrorist group. They still are in conflict to a large extent with the Colombian government, although there has been attempts to try to negotiate a peace deal with the ELN. The FARC is the longest, is the group that's fought the longest against the Colombian government, had the largest membership, and was the biggest threat to the Colombian government. And the Colombian government had a difficult time completely defeating the FARC militarily because of a lot of respects, because of the landscape of Colombia played a big role in hindering their capacity to defeat the FARC. Colombia has a significant number of mountains, it has jungle, it's got very rugged terrain. So it's very difficult for a government to completely wipe out a terrorist organization in this situation. And then also the FARC wasn't strong enough either to completely push back, take over the Colombian government and institute and create a unified state. So there was these elements that allowed this conflict to remain protracted for many, many, many years. And there were a number of instances of various types of terrorism over the years, perpetuated by the FARC, by the Colombian government, and also by groups that the Colombian government sponsored. So the FARC was involved in significant number of killings, bombings, kidnappings throughout throughout this entire protracted conflict, and was willing to engage in a lot of particularly heinous tactics to try and achieve their political objectives, create a communist state in Colombia. But the Colombian government was not innocent either. They were very willing to engage in committing atrocities, same elements, murders, extrajudicial killing, disappearances, kidnappings, and sometimes they would do it themselves, use their armed forces, but they also would at times fund right-wing paramilitary groups that would engage in terrorist tactics as well to try to intimidate populations that were perhaps supportive of the FARC. So on all sides in this conflict, there was a lot of blood on everyone's hands, and it, as I said, led to the deaths of 220,000 people at least that we know about, and that has roughly been established as the likely number of people dead. But that's not even a guarantee; it's potentially much more. So this protracted conflict eventually led various leaders at points throughout the time to try, leaders of the FARC and leaders of the Colombian government, to try and negotiate a peace deal. Happened in certain points in the 1980s, in the 1990s, 2000s, but the moment that really started to bring about a change and bring about a real push for the peace deal that was actually ultimately accepted began in 2012. Colombia inaugurated a new president, and this president, who initially seemed fairly militant towards the FARC, began secret negotiations. And over this 4-year period from 2012 to 2016, there were a lot of secret negotiations that happened, many of them occurring in neutral third countries. A lot of the negotiations happened where leaders of the FARC and leaders of the Colombian government would fly to Havana in Cuba to carry out these negotiations. And eventually in 2016, they ended up coming to an agreement on a peace deal. But it wasn't as simple as the government and the FARC simply agreeing to a peace deal. That was extremely extensive in terms of the provisions it laid out. There were, I believe there's estimated 570 individual stipulations of what has to occur for the peace deal to be maintained. And this involves demilitarization by the FARC. It involves recognizing the FARC as a legitimate democratic political party to compete in elections. It involves a Truth and Reconciliation Committee, government admitting to certain atrocities that it committed, funding of right-wing paramilitaries. So there's a lot of elements to this peace deal. And once the deal was agreed upon, initially it was put up to a national referendum in Colombia to allow the people to decide whether it would be passed and whether this would ultimately bring about peace. But it actually failed because a lot of people in Colombia felt that it was too lenient on the FARC. There was a lot of concerns that it gave too much immunity to individuals and leaders in the FARC who had been involved in previous atrocities, but there are also concerns about whether the government was getting away with certain things as well. And so this ultimately led the national referendum to fail. And so there was a bit of renegotiation to the ultimate deal, and ultimately the Colombian parliament passed the deal, made it law, and came to a peace agreement with the FARC. And I highly recommend, if you're interested, to go check out a lot of the elements of the negotiations, the ultimate peace deal. It's a very, very long, extensive process, too long to just cover in one brief case study when we're trying to think about the ending terrorism. But what's important to know is, and to focus on, is the difficulty with which it is, by which governments can try, and governments and non-state terrorist actors can try to ultimately come to a solution. I mean, we see here from 1964 to 2016 is what we have 52 years or so where we have conflict between the Colombian government and the FARC, and finally they're able to come to a peace deal that is quite tenuous at the moment. There's a lot of concerns about it failing. A number of people who demilitarized with the FARC have returned to taking up arms, have joined the ELN, which continues to engage in a protracted struggle with the Colombian government. So it's extremely difficult for governments to try and negotiate peace deals with terrorist organizations, non-state actors. Again, this is for the purposes of this argument, we're calling the FARC a terrorist organization. And it's extremely difficult to then not only come to that agreement, but then maintain it. And that's an important thing as well to think about. It's not just the process of finally agreeing, but having to go through the constant maintenance of this type of agreement to finally bring about change that ultimately creates a permanent peace. And this is a real concern, and even for a country like Colombia that has a strengthening democracy that brought the FARC in to compete as a legitimate political party, there's still concerns about large contingents of the organization returning to violent conflict rather than wanting to continue to engage in the democratic political process to achieve their goals. So coming to peace agreements between and ending terrorism when you have conflicts between governments and non-state actors, then it is an extremely long and difficult process. But again, the fact that they were able to get here, gives us some hope as well. It's not to say it's a hopeless process. So to end, I want to give you your third and final discussion question, your last discussion question of the term. And as I said at the very beginning of class, I was going to give you a discussion question that we were going to circle back to once we reach the end of the term. So now that we've had a whole class on terrorism, when you hear the word terrorism, what are your thoughts? Again, now that we've had a whole class on terrorism, when you hear the word terrorism, what are your thoughts? Think back to what some of your initial thoughts were when you heard the term. Now think about it in the context of a whole class covering the subject. How do you think about it differently? What pops into your mind? What's different than before? And I think this is a good way for us to try to engage and think about the class as a whole. And so just to finish up here, finalize this last case study, I want to say thank you all so much for a great semester. Know this is strange, full online class, very different than the Franklin and Marshall model, but I appreciate all the hard work that you all put in. It was really good trying to get to know a lot of you, although it was in a remote, distant type environment. But I really appreciate the hard work that you all put in, and especially since this is my last class I'll be teaching at Franklin and Marshall. I'll be, as soon as I finish putting your grades in, log those in, I'll be done at Franklin and Marshall. And so, bit of a surreal experience, but I'm really happy to have had at least this one last experience teaching with you all, and I really appreciated all the work you put in. So, with that, I'll leave it from there, and I hope you have a great rest of your summer. Thanks so much.